Words can be scripted, but the body does not know how to lie. In the most infamous disappearance case of the 21st century, we often hear about a mysterious stranger or a gemmed window. But what happens when the most critical clues are not found at the crime scene, but on the faces of those left behind? Why would a father roll his eyes when discussing his partner's grief? Why does a subconscious headshake appear the moment they claim innocence? Today, we are not hunting for a suspect in the shadows. Instead, we are decoding the chilling nonverbal signals, the out-of-place smiles, and the unnatural calm that have been overlooked for nearly 2 decades. Do not look away. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now as we peel back the layers of this contradictory behavioral profile. The truth might be hiding in plain sight, starting with a brilliant but haunting sunset in Portugal. The story begins not with a crime scene, but with the warm, golden hues of a holiday sunset in Portugal. It was early May in the year 2007. The location was Praia da Luz, a destination that promised tranquility, family bonding, and a break from the rigorous professional lives of the travelers. Among the guests were a group of friends, later dubbed by the media as the Tapas Seven. And at the center of this narrative were 2 doctors, Jerry and Kate, along with their family. To understand the gravity of the events that followed, one must first analyze the psychological atmosphere of the days leading up to the disappearance. According to retrospective interviews and transcripts, the mood was one of celebration. The mother, Kate, later described the family unit as feeling complete and incredibly lucky. However, investigative analysis of their statements reveals a complex dynamic beneath this surface of perfection. The apartment booked for the family was situated on the ground floor, a detail that would later become a focal point of forensic scrutiny. It was part of a larger resort complex, designed to feel open and welcoming. However, security experts have since pointed out that openness often comes at the cost of vulnerability. The apartment featured a patio door, which, according to the narrative provided by the parents, was left unlocked to allow them easier access to check on their sleeping daughter and the other family members. This decision creates the first major point of contention in the behavioral analysis of the case. In a foreign country, in an unfamiliar environment, the decision to leave a door unlocked implies a profound, perhaps even illogical, sense of security. It suggests a mindset where the parents believed that the boundaries of the resort acted as a magical barrier against the outside world. The dinner routine and risk assessment. On the evening of the disappearance, the group of adults gathered at the Tapas restaurant. The restaurant was close to the apartments, roughly situated within a short walking distance. But crucially, it did not offer a direct, unobstructed line of sight to the room where the daughter lay sleeping. In later interviews, the mother justified this arrangement with a statement that has baffled many observers. She remarked, "We can eat here. That will be ideal. The family won't be disruptive." This choice of words is significant. The focus appeared to be on the convenience of the adults and the avoidance of disruption to their evening, rather than a stringent adherence to safety protocols. Behavioral analysts reviewing the footage noted that when the parents discussed this decision, there was a lack of defensive posturing initially, which later shifted to intense defensiveness as public scrutiny mounted. The logic presented was that checking on the room every 20 or 30 minutes was sufficient. However, this checking system was informal and lacked the continuity of professional care. It was a system built on the assumption that nothing bad could happen. A classic example of optimism bias, where individuals believe they are less at risk of experiencing a negative event compared to others. Parental detachment and objectification. A particularly striking element emerged from the analysis of the parents' descriptions of their daughter prior to the event. In the interview transcripts, there is a distinct focus on the physical appearance and the management of the daughter. The mother described the daughter as having a perfect head and being beautiful and compact. While these are affectionate terms, analysts have noted a subtle thread of objectification. The daughter was described almost as an aesthetic object that completed the family picture. Furthermore, there were comments regarding the daughter's behavior, with the father noting she was a screamer and the mother alluding to her being active. These comments, while normal in the context of parenting, take on a different weight when viewed through the lens of the disappearance. Was there an underlying level of exhaustion or frustration within the parental unit? The desire for a peaceful dinner, free from disruption, suggests a need for separation from the demands of parenthood, if only for a few hours. The psychology of the Tapas Seven. The group dynamic of the Tapas Seven also plays a critical role in establishing the scene. This was a collective of educated, professional individuals. There is a sociological phenomenon often referred to in these cases as middle-class security. It is the unspoken belief that tragedy is something that happens to other people, in other places, not to doctors dining in a reputable European resort. This collective overconfidence may have created an echo chamber where risky decisions, such as leaving young family members unattended in an unlocked ground-floor apartment, were normalized. No one in the group appeared to challenge the safety of the arrangement. They validated each other's choices, reinforcing the illusion that they were in control of the environment. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that fateful Thursday, the atmosphere in the restaurant was described as convivial. But just meters away, the safety barrier that the parents believed in was non-existent. The unlocked patio door stood as a silent testament to the failure of risk assessment. When analyzing the interviews conducted years later, the father's demeanor when recalling this specific time frame is notable. He spoke of a moment of happiness and perfection shortly before the alarm was raised. However, his nonverbal cues, specifically a dismissive eye roll when the mother discussed her grief, hint at a disconnect. Why, in hindsight, would a parent recall the perfection of the evening so vividly when it was the prelude to their greatest loss? This chapter sets the stage not for a random act of misfortune, but for a sequence of events facilitated by a series of choices. The narrative of the abduction relies heavily on the premise that the parents were vigilant and unfortunate. However, a closer examination of the setting and their mindset suggests that the stage was set by a casual approach to security and a prioritization of adult leisure over strict supervision. The tragedy, it seems, began long before the alarm was raised. It began with the assumption that they were untouchable. The central enigma of the Praia da Luz case often circles back to a single, pivotal choice made by the parents: the decision to dine separately from their sleeping family members. While the media storm that followed focused heavily on the aftermath, a forensic examination of the parents' own statements reveals that this choice was not a calculated risk, but rather, as the mother described it, a decision where risk assessment never came into it. The logic of convenience. In investigative interviews, the mother, Kate, provided a candid window into the reasoning behind leaving the young family members unattended in the apartment. She explained that the decision did not stem from a major philosophical stance on parenting, but rather from a desire for practicality and enjoyment. She stated that she was just thinking practically and wasn't sure if it was worth that effort, if it would be as enjoyable to bring the young ones along to the restaurant. This admission is crucial for behavioral analysts. It suggests that the primary motivation for the arrangement was the comfort of the adults. The mother elaborated that the plan was simply, "We can eat here. That'll be ideal. We'll get them sorted, and then we can all eat." To the investigative eye, this statement reveals a prioritization of a seamless social evening over the logistical challenges of managing 3 very young family members in a public dining setting. The parents viewed the sleeping arrangement as a solution to a potential disruption rather than a safety vulnerability. The illusion of the check. The parents and their group of friends, the Tapas Seven, established a routine of checking on the apartments at regular intervals. However, analysts have scrutinized the efficacy of this system. The mother later claimed that they felt incredibly lucky and that the family felt really complete during this holiday, reinforcing the idea that they were operating under a veil of optimism rather than vigilance. The transcript highlights a disturbing disconnect in their perception of risk. When asked if they ever thought something could happen, the mother replied, "It never for 1 second occurred to you that anything would take place." She went further to say that if they had perceived any risk, they would not have done it, implying that their failure to perceive danger was equivalent to the danger not existing. This circular logic, "it was safe because we didn't think it was dangerous," is a common psychological defense mechanism used to rationalize negligence after a tragedy occurs. The geometry of supervision. A critical point of contention in the investigative files is the physical layout of the resort and the parents' claim regarding their line of sight. The parents maintain that the restaurant was close enough for them to monitor the apartment. However, independent analysis contradicts the effectiveness of this monitoring. The source material notes that while they were dining, they could only see a portion of the building. Specifically, the view was of a closed window and wall area, meaning there was no actual way to keep an eye on the interior of the room or the well-being of the daughter. The observation of a wall is not the observation of a person. By relying on a cursory glance at the exterior of the building, the parents created a false sense of security. They were monitoring the structure, not the occupants. This distinction is vital. It transforms the narrative from "we were watching them" to "we were near them," a subtle but legally and morally significant difference. The unlocked door. Perhaps the most baffling element of the security failure was the state of the apartment's entry points. The investigation revealed that the parents left a large sliding glass door unlocked to allow themselves easy access during their checks. This door featured a handle that would have been easy for a young individual to operate. This detail raises two uncomfortable possibilities. The first is that the daughter, waking up and finding herself alone in a strange environment, simply opened the door and wandered out in search of her parents, a common behavior for young ones in distress. The second possibility is that the unlocked door provided an effortless point of entry for an intruder. The source material expresses deep skepticism regarding this lapse in security. The narrator notes the difficulty in understanding how one could leave a very young family member in an unlocked room in a foreign country, stating that many people struggle to leave even inanimate objects, like a cell phone, unlocked in a hotel room. This comparison underscores the deviation from standard protective instincts. The fact that highly educated professionals would leave their most vulnerable family members in a state less secure than one would leave a wallet suggests a profound cognitive dissonance or a complete suspension of judgment. The taken hypothesis versus wandering. The unlocked door also complicates the parents' immediate reaction. As later chapters will explore, the mother's immediate conclusion upon discovering the daughter's absence was that she had been taken. However, the physical reality of the unlocked sliding door makes the theory of wandering equally plausible. Why were the parents so quick to rule out the possibility that the daughter had simply walked out? Some theories presented in the analysis question why the children slept so soundly, leading to debates about whether the depth of their sleep made wandering unlikely in the parents' minds. This hypothesis, if considered, adds a complex layer to the discussion regarding supervision, painting a picture of priorities aimed at securing their own leisure time. Ultimately, this chapter of the narrative serves as a case study in the failure of parental intuition. The transcript indicates that the parents felt the arrangement was ideal because it allowed them to eat without the children being disruptive. They successfully solved the problem of their own convenience, but failed to solve the problem of their family's safety. The interviewer in the source material notes that the parents reiterated their reasoning in multiple areas, yet it remains hard to conceive how they missed the innate risk of the situation. This gap between the parents' internal logic and the external observer's common sense creates a permanent shadow over the case. It forces the audience to ask, was this a tragic mistake born of naivety, or was it a calculated gamble that cost them everything? The emphatic no given by the father, when asked about his involvement later in the timeline, stands in stark contrast to the casual yes they gave to the question of leaving their daughter alone that night. The security of the apartment was an illusion, held together only by the parents' belief that nothing bad could happen to them. As the evening progressed in Praia da Luz, The timeline of events began to hinge on the routine checks performed by the parents. This chapter focuses on the critical hour between the father's final visit to the apartment and the mother's subsequent discovery that the family unit had been fractured. A close examination of the transcripts and behavioral analysis reveals a stark contrast in how each parent recalls these final moments, suggesting a divergence not just in memory, but in emotional authenticity. The father's final visit. A contradiction of sentiment. According to the established timeline, the father, Jerry, returned to the apartment prior to the mother to check on the sleeping daughter. His verbal recollection of this moment paints a picture of idyllic family life. He described having a parental moment where he thought, "God, we're so lucky." Observing his 3 family members enjoying a lovely holiday, he claimed to have lingered for a few seconds, thinking about how beautiful his daughter looked, stating, "That's the last time I saw her." However, behavioral analysis of this specific segment raises significant questions. As the father recounted this moment of supposed perfection and love, his nonverbal cues did not align with his words. Analysts observed a pulling to the corners of the mouth, which is typically associated with negative emotion, coupled with a distinct eye roll. This eye roll was described as fairly dismissive. From an investigative standpoint, this creates a jarring disconnect. Why would a parent, recalling the final peaceful moment with their daughter, display a gesture of dismissal and negativity? The analyst suggests that perhaps the father was indicating non-verbally that he was misled by that moment, or that there was an underlying negative emotion related to that specific memory that he was not voicing. This incongruence between the happy verbal narrative and the dismissive physical display serves as an early red flag in the behavioral profile of the father. The mother's discovery. Sensory recall and panic. In contrast to the father's somewhat detached recollection, the mother's account of the evening is steeped in sensory detail. She recalled the events leading up to the disappearance with really vivid clarity, describing how the daughter was tired, cuddled on her knee, and even noting the specific storybook they read. If you're happy and you know it. She also remembered the specific treats they ate, mentioning crisps and biscuits. This high level of detail is often cited by forensic psychologists as an indicator of authentic traumatic memory. When the mother went to check on the apartment later that evening, her narrative shifts from domestic calm to immediate panic. She described seeing the curtains, which had been closed, swung open into the room, and revealed that the shutter was raised. Her internal reaction was instantaneous and absolute. "I just knew she'd been taken." The immediacy of this conclusion is noteworthy. Rather than searching the immediate vicinity for a wandering family member, the mother ran to the window and then legged it back to the restaurant to alert the group. While some critics argue that jumping to the conclusion of abduction is premature, her emotional display, described by witnesses as screaming and distraught, aligns with a parent in genuine shock. The clash of reactions at the table. The moment the mother returned to the table to break the news marks the point where the parents' behaviors diverge most sharply. The mother was frantic, screaming that she's gone. Someone's taken her. The father's reaction, however, was described by himself as disbelief. Behavioral analysis of the father's recollection of this moment uncovers a disturbing layer of emotion. As he recounted his wife's panic, his face displayed a brief flash of contempt. Contempt is a complex emotion involving a sense of moral or intellectual superiority. The analyst questions why a husband would feel contempt or disgust toward his wife's distress in such a crisis. Instead of immediate concern or shared fright, the father admitted he thought, "She can't be gone. There must be some confusion." The oops expression and emotional detachment. Further scrutiny of the father's interview reveals another nonverbal anomaly known as the oops look. As he discussed the impossibility of the daughter being gone, he displayed a fleeting expression of fear characterized by the pulling down of the corner of the mouth. In behavioral science, this specific expression is often found in individuals who have been caught out in something or who realize they know something they should not. This expression, combined with his earlier contempt, paints a picture of a man who was processing the situation on a completely different level than his grieving partner. While the mother was howling like a wild animal in despair, the father admitted he was not able to console her because he was paddling frantically below the surface. He even utilized a mouth shrug, a gesture indicating "I don't know," when explaining his inability to support her. The timeline of discovery leaves the audience with a profound sense of unease. On one side, there is the mother, whose memories are visceral, detailed, and emotionally congruent with the tragedy of a missing daughter. On the other, there is the father, whose recollections are marred by dismissive gestures, expressions of contempt toward his partner's grief, and a self-admitted detachment. The investigation into the timeline suggests that while both parents physically experienced the same event, their psychological journeys were vastly different. The mother appeared to be reacting to a sudden, horrific loss. The father, however, seemed to be managing a narrative, paddling to keep a composure that came across as cold and poker-faced to the outside world. This behavioral dichotomy raises a difficult question. Were they both reacting to the same shock, or were they processing the reality on entirely different psychological levels? In any investigation involving an alleged intrusion, the point of entry becomes the silent witness that corroborates or contradicts the testimonies given. In the case of the disappearance in Praia da Luz, the entire premise of the abduction theory rests heavily upon a single architectural feature: the bedroom window and its external metal shutter. As the investigation deepened, this physical evidence became the center of a confusing web of contradictions, particularly when cross-referencing the statements made by the father with the timeline of events. The mother's discovery, the open window. The narrative of the intrusion began with the mother's return to the apartment at 10 o'clock in the evening. Her account of this moment has remained consistent and vivid. She described entering the room and noticing a draft, stating that the curtains, which had been closed, swung open into the room. This movement revealed that the heavy external shutter was all the way up and the window itself had been pushed right across. From an investigative standpoint, this detail is crucial. It was this specific visual cue, the raised shutter and the open window, that triggered the mother's immediate conclusion that her daughter had been taken. She stated, "I just knew she'd been taken." The logic presented here is that no young family member could have raised the heavy shutters themselves, nor opened the window to that extent, thereby implying the presence of an external actor. The father's contradiction, the aghast revelation. However, when the father's version of events and subsequent explanations are analyzed, a significant logical flaw emerges regarding the security of that window. In his interviews, the father attempted to establish that they were responsible regarding the room's environment. He claimed that they had checked the window the first day they arrived, and that the curtains had remained drawn the whole week to keep the room nice and cool and dark. This statement implies a level of diligence, a confirmation that they understood how the room functioned. Yet, in the same interview, the father recounted a moment of shock following the disappearance. He stated that he went outside to investigate the window and was totally aghast to discover that he was able to lift the shutter from the outside. The logical gap. Knowledge versus surprise. Behavioral analysts and investigators point to this specific contradiction as a major credibility issue. The logic is stark. If the father had indeed checked the window on the first day as he claimed, he would have discovered immediately that the shutters could be raised from the exterior. Conversely, if he was truly aghast and surprised by this mechanical vulnerability after the event, it logically follows that he never actually checked the window security upon arrival. This discrepancy suggests two unsettling possibilities. The first is a post hoc attempt to portray a level of parental responsibility that did not exist, claiming to have checked the room to avoid the appearance of negligence. The second is that the narrative of the checked window was fabricated to support the abduction theory, only to be undermined by his later admission of surprise. As the source analysis notes, by simple logical processing, his surprise means he didn't check the window the first time. Deflection and blame shifting. The analysis of the transcripts reveals a psychological tactic known as externalization of blame. When faced with the reality that the room was accessible, the father's rhetoric shifted from personal responsibility to mechanical failure. He described the shutter mechanism as ludicrous, arguing that you shouldn't even be able to open the windows that way. By focusing on the design of the shutters, labeling it a ludicrous thing, the father effectively shifted the burden of the tragedy onto the resort's infrastructure. The implication was that the family was not at fault for leaving the daughter in an insecure room. Rather, the window manufacturer, or the resort management, was at fault for installing shutters that could be breached. The protective barrier myth. The parents operated under the assumption that the shutter acted as a protective barrier, presuming that one had to use the pulley mechanism on the inside to operate it. However, this assumption was never verified until it was too late. This reveals a dangerous reliance on perceived safety, the belief that a barrier is secure simply because it looks secure. Furthermore, the father's animated response when discussing the window stands in contrast to his lack of emotion regarding the loss itself. The source material highlights that he became more animated and showed more synchronized and emotive nonverbal communication when discussing these logistical details that cleared his name. He appeared totally aghast about the window mechanism, yet cold and poker-faced about the emotional reality of his daughter's absence. The window remains the most contested piece of physical evidence in the public eye. If the shutters were indeed raised from the outside, it supports the intruder theory. However, forensic tests in similar cases often show that raising such shutters from the outside requires significant force and creates noise that might have disturbed the other sleeping family members in the room. Ultimately, the paradox of the shutter serves to highlight the inconsistencies in the parents' timeline and behavior. The father's conflicting statements, claiming diligence while admitting ignorance of the mechanism, weaken the integrity of their account. It suggests a narrative being constructed in real time to defend against accusations of negligence, rather than a straightforward recounting of facts. The open window was meant to be the proof of a crime, but for many analysts, it became a detail filled with inconsistencies and unanswered questions. The moments immediately following the discovery of the disappearance serve as a critical juncture in understanding the psychological state of the parents. While the timeline of physical events is often debated, the emotional timeline, the sequence of reactions displayed by the parents when the alarm was raised, provides a rich field for behavioral analysis. The source material highlights a significant divergence in how the mother and father processed the initial shock, a contrast that raises questions about authenticity and prior knowledge. The mother's alarm, panic, and certainty. Upon discovering the empty bed and the open window, the mother's reaction was described as visceral and immediate. According to the interview transcripts, she returned to the dining group screaming, "She is gone. Someone has taken her." Witnesses and the parents themselves corroborate that the mother was clearly distraught during this time. This reaction aligns with what psychologists term acute stress response. The mother did not search the apartment extensively or assume the daughter had wandered off. She immediately leaped to the conclusion of abduction. While investigators have questioned the logic of assuming abduction so quickly without checking for wandering, the emotional intensity she displayed, described later as howling like a wild animal, suggests a genuine physiological reaction to a perceived trauma. Her behavior was chaotic, loud, and socially disruptive, which is consistent with a parent facing their worst nightmare. The father's response, disbelief and contempt. In stark contrast, the father's recollection of this moment is characterized by a surprising level of detachment. In the documentary analysis, he stated that his initial reaction was one of disbelief and that he thought she cannot be gone. He described the concept of the disappearance as the furthest thing from his mind. However, forensic analysis of the interview footage reveals a troubling non-verbal signal during this recounting. As the father described the mother's panic and her assertion that the daughter was taken, a brief flash of contempt appeared on his face. In the field of body language analysis, contempt is a distinct emotion, often associated with feelings of moral or intellectual superiority. This raises a difficult question for the investigation. Why would a husband feel superior or dismissive toward his wife's terror in the precise moment he learns his daughter is missing? The analyst suggests that this display is fascinating and inconsistent with the expected response of shared fear or concern. Instead of mirroring her distress, his non-verbal cues suggest he viewed her reaction with a level of disdain or knowing detachment. The oops expression. Perhaps the most significant non-verbal indicator identified in this chapter is what the analyst terms the oops look. As the father insisted in the interview that she can't possibly be gone, his face displayed a micro-expression of fear, characterized by the pulling down of the corner of the mouth. Behavioral experts note that this specific expression is often observed in individuals who have realized they have made a mistake or who have been caught out in a situation. It is a fleeting signal of regret or apprehension that contradicts the verbal narrative of confusion. While his words claimed, "This does not happen," his face signaled a recognition of a negative reality that he perhaps wished to conceal. The source notes that this expression is found in people who have been caught out in something or realize something that they shouldn't. The absence of urgent action. The narrative provided by the father further complicates the picture of the initial response. He admitted that during the ensuing chaos, he was not able to console the mother. He used a metaphor to describe his state, claiming he was paddling frantically below the surface while appearing calm above it. However, this description of internal turmoil does not match the external observation of his behavior. He was described by others, and even acknowledged the description himself, as cold and poker-faced during the crisis. While the mother was in a state of collapse, the father maintained a managerial distance. The analysis points out that he offered a mouth shrug, a gesture indicating "I don't know," when explaining why he could not comfort his partner. This lack of emotional leakage is unusual. While some argue that medical professionals are trained to compartmentalize trauma, the complete absence of visible empathy toward his grieving spouse creates a contrast that feels revealing to investigators. The analysis of the immediate reaction suggests that the parents were operating on two different psychological tracks. The mother appeared to be reacting to the event as it unfolded, with all the messy, loud, and uncontained emotion that implies. The father, conversely, appeared to be observing the event, processing it with a level of cognitive distance that allowed for expressions of contempt and calculated disbelief. The source concludes that the father's behavior, specifically the oops expression and the flashes of disgust, does not align with the reaction of a parent blindly struck by tragedy. Instead, it hints at a person managing a situation, frustrated by the lack of control, or perhaps frustrated by the partner's inability to maintain composure. The two lone figures' narrative they later presented to the media masks a deep divide in how that first hour was experienced, one in agony, the other in cold calculation. In the chaotic aftermath of any disappearance involving a family member, the initial hypothesis formed by the guardians is crucial. It dictates the immediate search radius, the allocation of resources, and the mindset of law enforcement. In the case of the events in Praia da Luz, a singular, unwavering theory was established within seconds of the alarm being raised, the theory that the daughter was taken. This chapter examines the speed at which this conclusion was reached, and why investigators and behavioral analysts find the dismissal of other possibilities to be a significant anomaly. The bypass of logical progression, standard protocol in missing person cases, particularly those involving young individuals, suggests a logical progression of possibilities. The first assumption is typically wandering, that the individual has woken up, become confused, and walked away. The second is an accident within the immediate vicinity. Only after these are exhausted does the theory of criminal abduction usually form. However, the source material highlights that the parents bypassed this standard progression entirely. The mother's immediate assertion upon returning to the restaurant was not, "She is missing," or "I cannot find her," but rather "She is gone. Someone has taken her." This definitive statement was made before a thorough search of the apartment complex or the surrounding grounds had been conducted. The analysis questions why the parents were so quick to say that she wouldn't have gotten up and left herself, especially given the physical reality of the apartment. As established in previous chapters, the sliding patio door was left unlocked, and it had a handle that was easy to pull open. It is entirely conceivable, and indeed probable, that a young person, waking in a strange room without their parents, would exit through the easiest opening to look for them. Yet, the parents immediately dismissed this likelihood in favor of a criminal narrative. The sedation hypothesis and parental neglect. The rigidity of the she was taken narrative forces a difficult question. Why were the parents so certain she did not wander? The investigation into their statements reveals a potential explanation that carries heavy implications. Some theories presented in the analysis suggest that the parents may have believed wandering was impossible because of the state the family members were in. There has been speculation, noted in the source material, that the parents, both medical professionals, may have administered some form of tranquilizer or sleeping medicine to the family members to ensure they would sleep through the dinner. If the parents knew the daughter was chemically sedated, they would logically know she could not have woken up and walked away on her own. Therefore, finding her bed empty would leave abduction as the only remaining option in their minds. If this hypothesis is true, it suggests a level of neglect and questionable parental practices regarding how they handled the family that night. It implies that the abduction conclusion might have been driven by a firm belief that the daughter was physically incapable of leaving under her own power, rather than just intuition. The failure to verify security. The swift adoption of the abduction theory also relies on the assumption that the window was the point of entry. As previously noted, the mother claimed the shutter was raised. However, this conclusion was reached without verifying the mechanics of the room. The parents did not go through the process of checking to make sure that, for instance, the window couldn't be opened from the outside before declaring a crime had occurred. They simply assumed the window was secure and that an external force must have breached it. This leap in logic, from seeing an open window to immediately diagnosing a kidnapping, bypasses the investigative due diligence expected of rational adults, especially doctors trained in observation. The analysis notes that they were so quick to land on this conclusion, which directed the entire focus of the initial response away from a local search and toward a manhunt. Behavioral indicators of a fixed narrative. The persistence of this narrative is further illuminated by the father's behavior in subsequent interviews. When discussing the possibility of the daughter leaving the room, the parents often shifted the conversation to the window and the shutter, reinforcing the intruder theory while minimizing the unlocked door. The source analysis points out that the parents' presentation often felt like the packing of a narrative. This is a technique where individuals provide excessive detail or specific logical pathways to convince the listener of a story, rather than simply recounting memory. By insisting she would not wander, they closed the door on questions about their supervision and the unlocked patio, forcing the public and police to look outward at a predator rather than inward at the family's choices. The immediate taken theory served a distinct psychological function. It absolved the parents of the negligence of the unlocked door. If the daughter wandered off and was injured, the fault would lie with the parents for leaving the door open. If she was taken by a criminal who broke in through a window, the parents become victims of a sophisticated crime rather than agents of their own misfortune. The analyst in the source material expresses frustration with this immediate assumption, noting that it is hard to conceive why they wouldn't consider the simpler explanation of wandering. This refusal to engage with the wandering scenario suggests to some that the abduction theory was adopted immediately and rigidly in the very first moments of the crisis, designed to protect the parents' reputation as much as it was meant to explain the disappearance. The narrative was set in stone before the first police officer even arrived, and it is a narrative they have never deviated from, despite the logical gaps it created. In the realm of forensic psychology and behavioral analysis, the interview acts as a canvas where the subconscious often paints a picture contradictory to the spoken word. As the investigation into the events at Praia da Luz progressed, the media and experts alike turned their scrutiny toward the extensive interviews given by the parents. While the couple often presented a united front, sitting side by side in countless broadcasts, a detailed examination of their individual nonverbal cues reveals a significant divergence. This chapter focuses on the mother, Kate, whose behavioral baseline and emotional displays offer a complex, yet arguably more authentic, portrait of grief compared to the stoicism observed elsewhere. The authenticity of sensory memory. One of the primary indicators of truthfulness in a witness account is the presence of sensory and specific details. Fabricated stories often lack peripheral detail because the cognitive load of inventing a lie focuses the mind only on the main event. However, the source material highlights that the mother's recollection of the hours preceding the disappearance was rich with specific, trivial details that are characteristic of genuine memory. During the analysis of the interview, the mother recalled the specific activities of the day, mentioning a mini-sail on a small boat and the fact that the daughter was tired after a full day. She vividly described the intimate domestic moments in the apartment, such as reading a specific storybook titled "If You're Happy and You Know It," and the daughter playing with her engagement ring. She even listed the specific snacks they consumed, recalling crisps and biscuits. The analyst notes that during this recounting, the mother consistently looked down and to the side. In the study of directional eye cues, looking down is often associated with the retrieval of internal dialogue or emotional processing, while looking to the side can indicate auditory or memory construction. The consistency of her gaze, coupled with the incredible amount of detail, suggests she was accessing actual memories rather than constructing a narrative in real time. To the investigative eye, this suggests that the memories of that evening are seared into her mind, a phenomenon often seen in individuals who have experienced a traumatic separation. Physiological indicators of distress. Beyond the verbal content, the mother's physiological responses during these recollections provide further insight. The source analysis points out a distinct unsteadiness in her breathing as she spoke about the final moments with her daughter. These shaky breaths are involuntary markers of high emotional arousal, commonly associated with nerves, grief, or deep sadness. Furthermore, the analyst observed specific micro-expressions that signal negative emotion. At the conclusion of her story about the evening routine, the mother displayed a lip compression and a pulling of the corners of the mouth. In nonverbal communication, lip compression is often a subconscious attempt to bite back negative words or contain overwhelming emotion. This display appears synchronized with her verbal narrative as she reached the end of the happy memory and approached the moment of loss. Her body physically braced against the emotional pain. This synchronization between word and action is a strong indicator of emotional authenticity. The frog story and genuine smiles. To establish a baseline for the mother's behavior, the analyst examined moments where she discussed topics unrelated to the disappearance, such as her desire for a family. In one segment, she recounted a story from her school days where she earned the nickname Frog and was known for wanting a large family. During this segment, the analyst noted a shift in her demeanor. As she spoke about her friends and her history, a smile appeared that was described as genuine, noting that it starts to reach her eyes. This suggests that, despite the tragedy, she was capable of accessing positive memories with authenticity. Crucially, when she mentioned how unbelievable the situation was, she displayed a micro head shake. This small, subconscious gesture aligned with her disbelief, reinforcing the analyst's view that she was not packing a narrative or manufacturing a persona, but rather communicating her internal state honestly. The contrast in emotional regulation. The investigation draws a sharp line between the mother's emotional turmoil and the father's detachment. While the father later described himself as paddling frantically below the surface to explain his lack of visible emotion, the mother did not seem to have such a filter. Witnesses and the source material describe her as being clearly distraught and screaming immediately following the event. The source notes that in later interviews, the mother was emoting a little bit more than she did in the initial weeks, suggesting a progression of grief rather than a rehearsed stagnation. The analyst argues that her behavior, the shaky breath, the downward gaze, the specific details, and the synchronized expressions of sadness paints a picture of a parent who is genuinely grieving. The behavioral divergence of the mother is critical to understanding the public perception of the case. While the couple was often criticized for their cold appearance, the analysis suggests that this descriptor applies more accurately to the father. The mother, upon closer inspection, leaked constant signals of distress. The analyst concludes that the mother did not appear to be offering what seems to be a bunch of excuses, but rather was providing details that added context to the tragedy. This perceived authenticity leads to a complex theory. Is it possible that within the parental unit there was a disparity in knowledge? The mother's nonverbal cues align with someone who experienced a shock, whereas the father's cues, as explored in previous chapters, aligned with someone managing a situation. The mother's behavior serves as the emotional anchor of the parent's narrative. If the audience were to judge the case solely on her nonverbal performance, the conclusion might lean heavily toward a tragic, external event. However, the investigation requires the puzzle pieces of both parents to be fitted together, and as the next chapter will reveal, the piece represented by the father does not fit nearly as cleanly into the picture of innocent bereavement. While the previous chapter established the mother's responses as consistent with the chaotic nature of grief, the behavioral profile of the father, Jerry, presents a starkly different and far more complex picture. Throughout the investigation and the subsequent media appearances, his demeanor has been a focal point for behavioral analysts. The source material for this analysis identifies a pattern of nonverbal cues that frequently contradict his verbal statements, creating a dissonance that has fueled skepticism for nearly 2 decades. The paddling metaphor versus the poker face. One of the most defining characteristics of the father's public persona is his extreme emotional control. In the documentary analysis, he addressed the public perception of him as cold and poker-faced. He offered a metaphor to explain this detachment, stating that while he appeared calm, he was paddling frantically below the surface. However, behavioral analysis questions the validity of this self-assessment. The source notes that even when recounting the most traumatic moments, such as the mother howling like a wild animal in grief, his reaction was not one of shared pain, but of exasperation. The analyst observed an exasperated sigh coupled with an eye roll as he recalled his partner's despair. This non-verbal leakage suggests not a man struggling to keep his head above water, but rather a man detached from, and perhaps even critical of, the emotional reality unfolding around him. The paddling metaphor implies effort in managing emotion, yet the poker face observed by the public appeared effortless and absolute. The contradictory head shake. A recurring red flag identified in the source material is the father's tendency to perform a micro head shake when making affirmative or definitive statements. In nonverbal communication, a head shake, moving the head side to side, typically signals no or a negative reaction. When this gesture accompanies a positive statement, it is termed nonverbal leakage, indicating a conflict between what the mind knows and what the mouth is saying. The analyst pointed out several instances of this behavior. When the father described the daughter's appearance, he displayed a micro nose shake that seemed desynchronized with his words. Similarly, when responding to the interviewer's questions about the impossibility of the disappearance, he shook his head while verbally affirming the situation. This subtle physical negation raises the question: was he subconsciously rejecting the narrative he was verbally constructing? The consistency of this tic suggests an internal struggle, potentially between the truth he held inside and the story he was presenting to the world, indicators of disgust and contempt. Further scrutiny of the father's facial micro-expressions reveals emotions that are incongruent with a grieving parent. The source material highlights consistent activity in the corner of the right side of his nose, In the facial action coding system, fax, wrinkling, or activity around the nose is the primary marker for the emotion of disgust, while the analyst acknowledges that this could be a baseline resting face. Its prominence during specific topics is telling. Additionally, the brief flash of contempt noted when discussing the mother's initial panic provides a window into his mindset. Contempt, a feeling of superiority, is an emotion rarely directed at a victim or a grieving partner unless there is a disconnect in the relationship or a judgment being made about their behavior. The analysis suggests that the father may have felt intellectual superiority regarding the situation, viewing the emotional chaos of the mother as unnecessary or problematic. Selective authenticity. Perhaps the most damaging observation for the father's credibility is the concept of selective authenticity. The source analysis notes that for the vast majority of the interviews, the father remained stilted and subdued. He showed very little to no genuine emotion regarding the loss of his daughter. However, this flat effect vanished entirely when the conversation shifted to evidence that implicated him or his wife. When discussing the ludicrous theory that they hid a body or moved it in a rental car weeks later, the father became animated and more synchronized. His anger and frustration in these moments appeared genuine. He engaged with the narrative, showed outrage, and displayed congruent body language. This contrast is vital. It demonstrates that he was capable of genuine public emotion, but that emotion was triggered by self-preservation and defense of reputation, not by the loss of a family member. As the analyst queries, "Why aren't you being more authentic and emotive during the times that it is implicative towards you?" The ability to be passionate about a rental car allegation but detached about the abduction itself creates a contrasting psychological profile that confused many observers, appearing more focused on defense than bereavement. The behavioral divergence of the father suggests a man who was approaching the disappearance as a problem to be managed rather than a tragedy to be mourned. His managerial style, checking the window, dismissing the mother's wailing, explaining away the lack of tears, served to build a wall between the public and the truth. While the mother's behavior leaked distress and trauma, the father's behavior leaked control, disgust, and negation. The source concludes that while the science of body language is not a black-and-white mathematical answer, the accumulation of these red flags on the father's belt paints a picture that is not looking positive. The audience is left to wonder, was his poker face a shield against pain, or was it a mask worn to conceal a secret that only he fully understood? In the theater of public opinion, the behavior of the victim's family is often scrutinized as heavily as the evidence itself. For the parents in the Praia da Luz case, their demeanor in the weeks and months following the disappearance became a central point of global debate. To the casual observer, and indeed to many seasoned investigators, they appeared remarkably composed, a trait that was frequently interpreted as cold or poker-faced. This chapter investigates the rationale behind this emotional containment and examines whether it was a calculated strategy or a mask for a different reality. The advice of restraint. As public criticism mounted regarding their dry eyes and steady voices, the parents offered a specific, albeit controversial, explanation. They stated that they had been professionally advised to withhold public displays of grief. According to the research presented in the analysis, the reasoning was that showing emotional turmoil, tears, screaming, or despair could provide a level of gratification to the individual responsible for taking the daughter. The theory posits that the perpetrator might be watching the media coverage and would derive satisfaction from seeing the pain they had inflicted. Therefore, the parents claimed they made a conscious decision to deny the abductor this satisfaction. By presenting a united, stoic front, they believed they were protecting their daughter and refusing to play into the hands of the criminal. The double-edged sword of composure. From a strategic standpoint, this advice, if it was indeed given, proved to be disastrous for their public image. The source analysis notes that by following these terms, the parents presented themselves as uncaring and detached to the world. This perceived lack of emotion did not just affect the tabloid headlines. It had a tangible impact on the investigation itself. The father admitted in interviews that this approach led to a trial by media filled with misinformation and doubt. He noted that as doubt spread among the general public, it also permeated the authorities. He described how the government and authorities kind of withdrew, leaving the family feeling hampered and very alone in their search. The tragedy of this strategy is that by trying to thwart the abductor, they arguably alienated the very public and officials whose help they desperately needed to find their daughter. The paddling defense versus reality. To counter the narrative that he was emotionless, the father used a vivid metaphor in his interviews. He claimed that while he appeared calm, he was paddling frantically below the surface. He argued that the public did not see the prolonged periods of crying or the days of grief and despair that occurred behind closed doors. However, behavioral analysis of the interview footage suggests a disconnect in this defense. When the father recalled the mother's howling grief, his nonverbal response was not one of shared trauma, but of exasperation. The source notes an exasperated sigh and an eye roll as he remembered her emotional state. This reaction undermines the paddling metaphor. If he were truly struggling with his own hidden grief, one would expect a display of empathy or shared pain when discussing his partner's collapse. Instead, his demeanor suggested a man who was fed up with the emotional displays rather than one who was suppressing his own. The failure of the coaching theory. The coaching defense, that they were told not to cry, attempts to explain the absence of sadness. However, it fails to explain the presence of other contradictory emotions identified by analysts. The source material points out that while coaching might suppress tears, it does not account for the micro headshakes when making affirmative statements or the flashes of contempt and duping delight observed on the father's face. A person holding back tears looks very different from a person feeling superior or defensive. The analyst argues that the emotional detachment displayed by the father goes beyond professional restraint. While medical professionals are trained to maintain composure, the father's detachment persisted even when he was no longer in a crisis management role. Furthermore, the mother, also a doctor, was unable to maintain this facade to the same degree, leaking genuine distress that highlighted the father's abysmal lack of affect by comparison. The pact of silence regarding their emotions created a vacuum that the public filled with suspicion. By refusing to show the vulnerability expected of grieving parents, they inadvertently built a wall between themselves and the world. The analysis in the source material concludes that this strategy, whether self-imposed or externally advised, created a perception of two lone figures fighting a battle that no one else could understand. The father's claim that he kept his turmoil under the surface is difficult to reconcile with the contempt and disgust that occasionally broke through that surface. Ultimately, the strategy of stoicism may have denied the abductor gratification, but it also denied the parents the benefit of the doubt, leaving a legacy of skepticism that persists to this day. In the lexicon of deception detection, there is a concept known as packing the narrative. This occurs when an individual, rather than giving a direct and simple answer to a yes or no question, clutters their response with excessive logic, irrelevant details, and defensive justifications. This phenomenon became the focal point of perhaps the most intense segment of the interviews analyzed in the investigation. The interviewer posed the most direct and confronting question possible. "Did you kill your daughter?" The immediate reaction of the mother was a simple, quiet no, accompanied by a micro headshake. Behavioral analysts categorize this response as likely authentic. The movement was small, subconscious, and synchronized with the denial. However, the father's response provided a stark behavioral contrast. Instead of a simple denial, he began to pack his answer. He engaged in a postural rechange, shifting his body in the chair, and utilized a manipulator gesture on his face, touching his face in a way often associated with agitation or the blocking of the eyes. He proceeded to stammer through a complex explanation, stating, "There is nothing with any logic that could. You would have to start with why, how, when, who." He argued that there was nothing to suggest anything, effectively answering a question about his actions with a statement about the lack of evidence. The source analysis identifies this as a textbook example of packing a narrative. An innocent individual usually feels no need to explain the logic of why they did not commit a crime. The denial is absolute. By retreating into intellectual arguments about the how and when, the father distanced himself from the moral weight of the question. He concluded by calling his answer an emphatic no. But to the trained eye, the verbal clutter and the indicators of insecurity, such as the shuddering breaths and shrugging, eroded the credibility of that denial. Weeks after the initial disappearance, the investigation took a sharp turn when allegations arose concerning a rental vehicle hired by the parents 24 days after the event. The theory proposed by some investigators was that this vehicle was used to transport the daughter's body. When this specific allegation was brought up in the interview, the father's demeanor underwent a radical transformation. For the majority of the interviews, the father remained emotionally flat, a state he described as being cold and poker-faced. Yet, when the conversation shifted to the rental car and the idea of hiding a body, he became animated and authentic. He expressed outrage, calling the suggestion ridiculous and pointing out the logistical absurdity of hiding a body for weeks before moving it. The source analysis finds this shift to be highly revealing. The father appeared very interested and engaged in dismantling this specific theory. His nonverbal communication became synchronized with his words. His anger looked real. This raises a critical question regarding selective authenticity. Why was he able to show genuine passion and congruent body language when defending his logistical competence, but remained robotic and detached when discussing the actual loss of his daughter? This anomaly suggests that the father felt on safer ground when debating facts and timelines, areas where he could use his intellect to win the argument. The rental car theory was something he could disprove with logic, and he did so with vigor. In contrast, the emotional reality of the abduction did not elicit the same genuine engagement, reinforcing the profile of a man primarily concerned with the mechanics of the case rather than its tragedy. Throughout the years following the event, the parents consistently employed a psychological defense mechanism known as externalization. Rather than accepting responsibility for the choices made that night, specifically the decision to leave the young family members alone in an unlocked apartment, the narrative was shifted to blame external factors and entities. The father expressed frustration with the shutters, describing the mechanism that allowed them to be opened from the outside as a ludicrous thing. The implication was that the fault lay with the window design, not with the failure to secure the room. Furthermore, the parents directed significant blame toward the media and the authorities. They described a trial by media full of misinformation, lies, and smears, which they claimed hampered the search. The father argued that the UK government and the authorities kind of withdrew, and that the family felt very alone and like they were fighting a million battles. While the media scrutiny was undoubtedly intense, behavioral analysts note that this focus on enemies served to distract from the core issue of parental negligence. By painting themselves as victims of a system and a predator, they avoided the internal reflection that the abduction was only possible because of the environment they created. The source analysis highlights a specific contradiction in this external blame. The father claimed they were threatened with breaking judicial secrecy if they discussed the investigation, yet they used this as a shield to explain their lack of transparency. This constant deflection creates a pattern where the parents are never the agents of the tragedy, only the recipients of bad luck and systemic failure. A careful observation of the parents as a couple reveals a distinct hierarchy in their communication and emotional expression. Throughout the interviews, the father often took the lead, acting as the primary narrator and the gatekeeper of information. The source material notes that, while the mother occasionally spoke with vivid, sensory detail, she often looked to the father or checked in with him before or after answering difficult questions. This dynamic was particularly evident during the "Did you kill your daughter?" segment. The mother answered immediately. But then the father took over the airspace, filling the silence with his complex, packed narrative. The analyst observes that the father's dominance in the interviews might explain the stilted nature of their interactions. He often corrected the narrative or steered it back to logistical points, such as the window or the timeline, whenever the emotional waters became too deep. The image they presented was of two lone figures, but the internal structure of that unit appeared imbalanced. The mother's genuine distress often stood in the shadow of the father's controlling stoicism. This has led some observers to speculate on whether the mother was fully aware of the entire truth, or if she was being guided through the crisis by a partner who was managing the situation with a cold and intellectual grip. The disparity in their non-verbal cues, her sadness versus his contempt, suggests that they were experiencing the aftermath of the event from two very different psychological vantage points. One of the most persistent theories surrounding the case is that the daughter died in the apartment due to an accident, and the parents subsequently concealed the death. The father addressed this theory directly, using it as an opportunity to display his logical prowess. He argued that the timeline made such a scenario impossible. If she died when we were in the apartment, why would we cover that up? He asked, adding that it gets even more ludicrous to suggest they hid a body while friends were dining nearby. He broke down the logistics. The only time the daughter was unattended was during dinner, so if she died then, how could they have disposed of the body immediately? The source analysis concedes that from a strictly timeline-based perspective, the cover-up theory is difficult to execute. However, the analyst notes that the father's behavior during this explanation was animated and authentic. He seemed relieved to be arguing against a theory that had logistical holes. Yet, this logical defense does not erase the behavioral red flags observed elsewhere. The analyst argues that while the logistics of a cover-up are hard to believe, the behavior of the father, the contempt, the duping delight, the head shakes, keeps the suspicion alive. The tension between the impossible timeline and the deceptive behavior creates the enduring mystery of the case. The father relied on logic to clear his name, stating there is nothing with any logic to suggest their involvement, but human behavior is rarely governed by pure logic, and his body language told a story that his words tried to deny. In the final moments of the analysis, the investigation circles back to the enduring nature of the case. The parents concluded their interview with a vow of persistence. "We will not rest until we find our daughter," the father stated, asserting that they would keep looking forever. However, even in these final declarations, the non-verbal cues offered a contradictory narrative. As the mother spoke about the daughter being out there and needing to be found, she displayed a substantial eye blocking, a prolonged closure of the eyes. This was accompanied by a lip compression and the pulling of the mouth corners. Eye blocking is a subconscious attempt to remove oneself from a visual reality or to hide from a lie. The analyst interprets this cluster of gestures as an indication that the mother may not truly believe the daughter is alive. It suggests a deep internal despair that seems to conflict with the hopeful words being spoken. The source concludes with a somber assessment. The analyst states that while the mother's behavior could be attributed to grief, the father's behavior is abysmal and revealing. The accumulated evidence of his micro-head shakes, flashes of contempt, and packed narratives leads the analyst to a position of deep skepticism. The two lone figures remain standing, leaving the public with a lingering sense that there are still complexities in this case that have yet to be fully understood. The investigation ends not with a solution, but with a disturbing realization. The people who should be the most transparent, the parents, remain the most opaque elements of the entire tragedy. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the behavioral analysis of one of the most perplexing disappearances in modern history. We have journeyed through the timeline, the contradictions, and the silent language of the body that often speaks louder than words. This analysis relies on the interpretation of non-verbal communication, which, while a powerful tool, is not an exact science. It serves to add context and question narratives, but it does not provide legal proof. We encourage you to look at the details yourself and form your own conclusions based on the information presented. If you found this breakdown valuable, please consider engaging with the content to help us continue these investigations. A special thanks to the sponsor, Trainwell, for supporting this deep analytical work. If you are looking to take control of your own fitness journey with professional guidance, do check them out. Let us know your thoughts in the discussion section. Did you see the same red flags? Do you interpret the poker face as grief or guilt? Until next time, stay observant and stay safe. Cheers, everyone.